Thanks for joining our session. Let me introduce you to our panel today. Starting from the extreme right, we have Manjaree Chowdhary, Senior Executive Officer and General Counsel, Maruti Suzuki India Limited. We have Rihab Dias, India Legal Counsel at Upekkha. On my left, we have Dharini Mathur, Principal Counsel, IFC. And we have Mini Vandepol, Asia Pacific Head of Baker McKenzie's Investigations, Compliance and Ethics Group. Thanks all for joining us today. And then coming to our topic of discussion today, ESG has become a very pertinent topic of discussion in the current times. Surely the question has changed from why ESG, what is ESG, to how do I incorporate ESG, how do I measure ESG, how do I improve my performance, ESG performance. So no doubt proper management of ESG issues is needed for companies to manage risk, strengthen relations with their stakeholders, access capital, and create reputational benefits. But the regulatory and market landscape is constantly changing and becoming increasingly complex with new laws and changing perceptions. So are we as legal counsel well positioned to understand these risks and add value in supporting businesses and investors navigate the challenges? And with that, I put my first question to you, Manjaree. Manjaree, for you, what do you think, in your view, is the business imperative for ESG? Corporates are now increasingly focusing on ESG. There are Maruti, as a public listed company, is also at the forefront of this in India with the first set of regulations that have come about, and reporting has become mandatory. There are other companies that are also voluntarily adopting frameworks and making leadership statements on all kinds of pertinent issues, including circular economy, diversity, etc. So what is the driving force behind this ESG agenda, according to you?
Thank you, Upasana, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here and listening on a topic which is relevant and is interesting, and I hope the panel can lend some thoughtful insights on it. ESG is becoming a very important aspect of business. It has been there. Even in India, in some form, you found that there was a business responsibility reporting that all corporates were required to do at some point in time. It was more voluntary. Over the last year, we have seen now we have the business responsibility and sustainability report and disclosures that corporates have to make going forward from this year onwards. So how did it all happen, and how is it suddenly taking so much more importance and mind share? I think E, S, and G, the E is in the environment, and the S societal, and G governance. The governance part of it, I thought, was always there, and so was to some degree the societal. The environment part has become exceedingly important in the last few years, or at least a decade, but it has gained momentum in the last few years. The COVID actually precipitating this awareness across the world that we seem to be tampering with the environment. Mother Nature was not terribly pleased with us when COVID happened. So there was a conscious awakening, I felt, across the globe, that we seem to have gone a little too far ahead in our quest for making profit. So most corporates are for-profit organizations, and therefore that's the primary driving force, and also giving, sort of creating wealth for shareholders, etc. But the importance of being environmentally friendly and combined with that, becoming more socially aware was also something that really crept up and really took force and took momentum over the last 3 years. And you see that during COVID also, I was reading somewhere that, mutual funds that actually were invested in companies which had a high quotient of ESG happened to have seen much better returns than others. Today, it was earlier only about your stakeholders, which were your shareholders who were invested in the company, your investors, who were looking for some return on investment. Today, the very same people have started saying we look for a return on investment, but we want to see that this is done being a little more conscious of ESG, you know. So, and today your customer, you can't become a profit organization if you really don't have great customers who are going to buy your products. A customer today just does not want you see make a product. He also wishes you to see how you make the product, what that product, the impact that the product is going to have on the environment, or how he or she uses it, and how you are going to, what mechanisms are there for disposing of that product. I mean, I'm in the auto industry, so I can tell you it's not just about the making of the car, it's about how you make it, what you do with it, what impact it has on the environment while you're using it, and what do you do with the end of life of the car. So it's all about the entire, so you know, things have stepped outside of the doors of the factory and they've moved across the entire value chain. It is not, earlier when we used to talk about environment, we used to say it was a net zero harm game. That you would not, you would not want to have effluents. You would not have to, you had to make sure that there was no smoke or emission coming out, etc. That was it. From the paradigm shift that has happened is from no harm game to a net positive impact. So you can see the shift just from being a negative that it should not be harmful. Now you have to say it cannot be just not harmful, but it also has to have a positive impact on the environment and on the people and on the consumers that you have. So in this sort of background, of course, this has all been necessitated because of the entire, the climate change that we are seeing, the whole lot of issues in the world that we are noticing today. This has been precipitated by that. And today, moving from just your, where your stakeholders or your shareholders are your primary aspect, from there you move into something like where it is a more holistic capitalism, as I would call it. It is more holistic, where you see that you not only make profit, but you make profit in a more responsible manner. So, Upasana, to answer your question, I feel that is the real shift that has come.
And if I can put the next question to Minnie on my left. So Minnie, you advise a number of corporates and clients and across jurisdictions. The regulatory landscape is so dynamic, it's changing everywhere. There are new regulations and new trends. What, in your view, are the top risks facing businesses? And what are the focus areas for lawyers across the ESG spectrum? And do you think that lawyers do have a unique skill set to play a key role? Because as lawyers, you do involve yourself with a broad area of issues that ultimately do connect to sustainability and ESG risks as well.
Thank you, Upasana, and thank you for inviting me to speak here in Delhi. It's always nice to come home. So, yes, I think this is an interesting area because of a number of things. So let's start with the risk and regulatory landscape. We are seeing more regulations and laws coming out about ESG, particularly around disclosure requirements. So companies are being asked to disclose what they are doing in relation to all aspects of the E, S and the G. The E has been around for a while, as Manjaree said, but the S and the G, I think, haven't had as much time in the spotlight. The social issues we're talking about are things like, labour, employees' health and safety, data protection, a lot of issues that go to the heart of the social infrastructure of business. And then you've got governance, which in my view underpins all three, because if you don't have strong governance, if you don't have fully integrated governance structures within your organisation, that's when the scandals arise. And I'm sure all of you are well aware of what kind of scandals can arise. And generally what we see when we sort of tease apart or investigate some of these issues is that there's been a real failure in terms of the company walking the talk, right? So they may have all the right whistles and bells in terms of policies, procedures, codes of conduct, etc., but it hasn't been well integrated into the fabric of the business. It hasn't been integrated on the ground where the business is being conducted. And then when you've got that gap, that's where the failures can arise. So we can talk about the EU initiatives. There's been new EU regulations that require disclosure about your supply chain in terms of ESG performance of your supply chain, about your acquisition targets and what you've done for due diligence in terms of ESG when you are acquiring targets. We can talk about new legislation that's now in place in Hong Kong, in Malaysia, in Singapore, all around ESG performance, and we're seeing enforcement around that. For example, in Australia, there's been a recent case where the regulator has taken action against a company which said that its particular investment products were ESG strong, but it turned out that a number of their investments was in fossil fuel businesses. So we can talk about that. That's what we lawyers are very comfortable talking about. But actually, I think the real worth of lawyers, whether it's in-house or external, in this space is actually partnering with business. And we can do that very well because we understand what risk looks like. So we can also understand how to ameliorate, how to identify, how to mitigate. And we need to be brought in at an early stage, you know, rather than, I think about compliance lawyers, for example, as sort of the speed camera of business, you know. People like to slow down and look like they're compliant as they're going past the speed camera, or they'll take a different route where there isn't a speed camera. Or they'll bring in lawyers at the midnight hour. You know, you've got the transaction, it's nearly ready, and then they think, we need to bring in lawyers to you know, tick off the diligence or the reps and warranties, etc. Whereas I think with ESG and the governance requirements and expectations, lawyers can really add value right from the beginning, the strategic direction that businesses are taking, in order to think about how they can set the program, whether it's an acquisition. We do a lot of work in terms of looking at the background of targets, even before the company decides which target it's going to go after. And that's because at the heart of the real issues that we are faced in terms of ESG risks, it's about reputation. Because if you get it wrong, then it's reputations that will be damaged. Of course, there can be financial damages, there can be penalties, there can be a number of other elements, but what we really see is that the reputational damage, particularly for companies in India, where you've got strong corporates that are multinationals in their own right, who depend on the brand and the reputation that they have formulated. And if that is damaged, then of course there's a domino effect in terms of business opportunity, in terms of attracting capital from PE or other investment funds. So I think from a legal perspective, we need to be involved earlier, And I think if we focus on talking about the importance of real governance, not just the nice to have decorations or the papering of compliance, but real governance that is founded on integrity, that will be our role. And it's a fabulous role because guess what? It makes money. So now we're not talking about just nice to have or avoiding penalties. We're actually talking about value. And Manjaree mentioned that. Funds that are based on ESG strength in terms of the businesses that they support have been shown to perform better, and particularly over the COVID period. So there is real money to be made. And when lawyers are at the heart of that, I think their value is also appreciated.
To you, Dharini. So, Dharini, I'd like you to speak from an investor's perspective. Investors and lenders providing capital also factor in ESG factors in their investment strategies, in their risk monitoring. And at the same time, as the trends show, financial institutions are also being subjected to a lot of regulation. As asset owners, they also have to report. There are regulations being thought about on rating of instruments, as well as code of conduct, stewardship on the side of financial institutions. So in your view, how are things changing for financial investors in their approach towards portfolio companies, in how they diligence, in how they monitor, and is the approach different when it comes to emerging markets like India?
So actually, from an IFC standpoint, so I work at the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group, and it's nice to watch actually, because what we've been doing, what we see happening now is something that we've been doing for 50 years. So environmental and social standards have always been part of our investment requirements. We've always had those covenants on our borrowers or investee companies. And so it's good to actually watch how this is gaining traction. And I just want to step back and put this in a little bit of context, because why is it gaining traction? And while it may have hit home to all of us during the COVID period, I think there's a lot that's happened in the world prior to that, and it's the Paris Alignment, the Paris Agreement from COP21 in 2015, where I think there was a commitment made by the community at large, the world global community, to keep temperature rise below 2%, below 2 degrees. So flowing from that, I think the investor community has also committed to ensuring that capital flows will be aligned to the Paris commitment, right? So for example, IFC says that 100% of all our investments have to be Paris aligned. And what that means is that it does no harm. So it does no harm to the Paris alignment goals, which means that anyone we invest in must, their business must be either focused on mitigation or have incorporated the climate resilience aspect into the business. And it's not just us. So the multilateral world has definitely made this commitment and has come up with sort of a common framework for it. But the investor community at large has sort of committed to this. So then if you look at for a corporate in looking at raising money, you look at the supply side. So if the supply side and the investor community is essentially looking to put its money in certain kinds of projects, like Minnie said and like Manjaree alluded to earlier, it makes business sense for them to be aligned to what investors are looking for. So I think, there are lots of numbers that have been bandied about, but someone said you need about 23 trillion to meet these net zero targets. India needs $10 trillion to meet its net zero targets. Where's that money going to come from? It's going to come from people who have committed to these goals, or I think, Minnie, you were talking about how the EU has put in place several new requirements, and then most investors are either in the US or the EU or are MDBs, and they all have their own sort of reporting that you were talking about, Upasana, that they've made their own commitments to their shareholders and to the global community to meet certain targets. So if the supply side is going to be focused on this aspect of things, then it has to follow that the corporate community focuses on these requirements. And so I don't think it's, it's interesting to see there was a recent litigation in the English courts against Shell, claiming that the directors of Shell were in breach of their fiduciary obligations by not doing more. So Shell, I think, despite being in the energy business, is sort of really doing a lot, and they've put a lot of money and thought behind, decarbonization and doing stuff that's better and meeting, climate goals. But nonetheless, they were sued for their directors have been sued for not having done enough, and it's basically based on a fiduciary duties argument. So interesting for us as lawyers. I don't know how it's going to play out. I'm not sure if it's, there's really a legal case. But I think going back to the point that Manjaree was making earlier as well, businesses are looking to make a profit. The whole concept of ESG needs to sort of speak to that. Right? What's good for the world is good for me. That needs to drive, that needs to kind of hit home. And I think we're very close to the point where that's happening. 10 years ago, it was much harder for me to explain our performance standards to a client. It's much easier today. Right? There are costs of compliance, absolutely. But I think if you look at it from a long-term perspective, you have to look at the gains and countervail those costs. So I think that things are definitely changing, but they're sort of, all aligning towards in this kind of Paris Agreement target.
Yeah, agreed. At least there is some universal acceptance. And to Rihab, you represent a SaaS accelerator fund, and you're exposed to a lot of early stage companies, startups, founders. Now, some may argue that early stage companies may not, face any immediate regulatory pressure. They don't need to focus on ESG. It's a big cost. It's onerous. It doesn't really need to be on their priority because, their priorities should lie where, on innovation, for instance, or where, creating some shareholder value. But there are, obviously, now we have been talking about different types of ESG issues or sustainability issues, and concepts like diversity, equal wages, fair pay, eco-friendly practices. These are relevant even to small companies, right? So how should be the approach to ESG when it comes to early stage companies, and how can legal counsel play a role in supporting leadership in balancing these priorities?
Thanks Upasana, and thanks everyone. Thanks ABA. I'd like to just start with specifying that environment, social, and governance aspects have now become key corporate metrics for investor communities, for the board, for key stakeholders, employees, for decision making, to lead corporate stewardship, and also for building value of the enterprise itself. So I work with a lot of early stage startups, and we're not in the top 1,000 listed companies that need to adhere to the BRSR guidelines. However, the amount of money that has been flown into or been flooded into through ESG into the market, the buzz around it, I don't think there's a day that you'd open the news and not read about something about ESG. It's impossible that just flies through. Having said that, what is it that these new age startups who are listening to these buzzwords coming back and asking as to, we want to be proactive, we want to voluntarily report, how do we go about this? So as a legal counsel, I would think about taking 2 steps back, and like Minnie was mentioning, you need to understand the background. So as a legal counsel, one needs to sit down and understand what are the drivers based on which ESG compliance becomes important for an organization. The first driver, and then through these drivers, I'd like to probably touch upon how an in-house counsel can help. One of the drivers would be a CEO's vision for the company. So as we know, typically in my practice as a transactional lawyer, we've seen founders, even at Upekkha, in fact, that we see founders typically take one of three tracks. One would be aggressively try and become a unicorn, raise funds. The other option would be to go down the M&A route. And the third would be to be a founder forever. Now, not a lot of people understand this, but yesterday the Solicitor General mentioned we have about 105 unicorns. And there's this company called Zoho. I'm not associated with it, but it's a completely bootstrapped company that has become a unicorn. So there are different tracks that a founder can take. And at this point, I think it becomes very critical for understanding what is the CEO's vision, where does the company stand, where do they want to go in the next 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year, and what do we do as a council to help you get there. Having said that, if, say, for example, I take one of these tracks, say an M&A route, what is the kind of acquirer the company wants to get attracted towards? Is it a strategic, is it a financial? If it's a strategic advisor, how are they looking at ESG? And materiality becomes so critical when it comes to ESG because, like I again mentioned, I work with SaaS companies, so the E component is very, very silent. It's the S and the G is where we can work. The G, of course, is where we, as in-house counsels, can provide the most amount of control. However, S has, there's a new angle to S as well. Now it's diversity, equality, integration, inclusivity, and belonging. Because it's also, ESG is the first time that's bringing the aspect of community to the table, which I don't think any legislation or any kind of principle ever brought through. So understanding that there are 39 varieties of diversities, gender being one. So what is the CEO's vision? Which aspects, at least for the companies that I work with, are they going to align with for the S and the G? Taking one of the tracks with respect to M&A, how are they then going to do a reverse due diligence or a cleanup due diligence, for example? How then can an in-house counsel work towards, okay, we've got a runway of X amount of money. This is the materiality with which we're going to go with between the S and the G. What are the different aspects that we have budgets for? Because that's the transition that I saw when I moved from firm practice to becoming a counsel. In-house counsel is budgets become a huge topic of discussion, right? That typically wasn't the case for me. So having those tough conversations, having the spine to speak to the CEO about this, or even, for example, if somebody wants to stay as a founder forever, and requires working capital, needs to still probably raise loans. And as of very recently, a mid-size petrochemical company received benefits of lower than 400 basis points for being ESG compliant. The banks actually are giving better interest rates for companies. So for you and me, maybe that's about somewhere between 7.5 and 7.1. But when you're raising that amount of money, it's a huge upside for a company. The second driver that I'd like to talk about are new disclosure norms. An in-house counsel, of course, has to be abreast with what's happening. Data becomes critical here as well. So understanding what are the new laws that are coming in, being abreast, having the right external counsels that we interact with who are also supercharged and understand the ESG market. I'd like to move to the next driver, which would be investor pressure. LPs are now conscientious. They want to know where is their money being floated. Investors are now also getting accustomed to the way data is being presented to them. It's coming in a very systematic, not on a spreadsheet. The MIS reports are getting even more structured. So if this is becoming market standard, to be and to have a competitive edge, one has to provide that data also in a very systematic manner. It needs to be investor-grade data, which is auditable, it's transparent, it's clear. So I feel that as an in-house counsel, we also need to be mindful of the softwares that we're bringing on board. Are they going to be in a position to have updated regulatories needs being met through those softwares? Are they going to stand the test of audit security? So there are a lot of benefits I feel that these drivers are going to have. The last one, of course, Minnie touched upon is reputation. So it's easy for startups to just have the attachment for we are now ESG compliant and now we are sustainable. It's easy to just pick on these words and say we want the upside, but what are you willing to walk the talk? Are you going to be implementing what you're going to be stating? Yes, we're not mandatorily required to report, but the information that's going up on your website or your social media, everything's going to have an impact on you. So I feel the in-house counsel has a lot to offer right now, and it's very exciting because earlier, the kind of practice that I've always done is you just went through the whole transaction. Right now, I have the ability to pick and choose whether I want to be focused on the S and work with just those companies or just the G, or if I'm an activist, I would like to move more towards the E and find companies that I can work with. So I'm really excited about this new phase. And happy that younger companies are also getting mindful because it does have a lot of benefit from what we're noticing. Thank you.
Thanks, Rihab. So I'd like to explore the flip side a bit now. How much ESG is too much ESG and what are the unintended consequences? So maybe you alluded to it, Minnie, so I'll start with you. We discussed there are a lot of internal and external pressures on organizations to increase their commitment to ESG, and they are responding to it. But how effective are companies in defining their boundaries on their ESG initiatives, right? You alluded that in some geographies, we have seen a growing legal trend of enforcement action, of shareholder and collective action, which are targeting essentially false representations or alleging false representation, and they want to hold corporations accountable for what they state, right? So as lawyers, as you did mention that early intervention of lawyers may help, because as lawyers, do we have some insight over what level of disclosure could be excessive or could lead to legal or reputational risk? And in your experience, are boards and are companies adequately discussing these risks with their counsels?
That's a lot of things in that one question. So maybe if I start by talking about these actions that we've seen, and they're referenced as greenwashing actions. It is interesting because I think there's another term, I'm not quite sure if it's green hushing, yes. So this is about companies being worried about putting their head above the parapet, and saying that they're doing something in case somebody challenges them and holds them accountable and they can't meet the statements that they've made. So it is interesting because I think that there is politically it's quite a charged topic. A lot of Republicans in the US are anti-ESG and call it woke capitalism. And in some respects they are right, because it is taking into account things that we probably haven't taken into account in terms of the way businesses have run. But that's probably why we've had so many issues such as environmental damage and things like the health impact of asbestos and many other issues that have really crippled society. But it is a driver that I don't see being driven down. And the reason for that, as I alluded to in my first answer, was there's like hundreds of trillions of dollars available to be invested and having the investment directed towards ESG strong or ESG leaders in the corporate sector. And I think that is going to really drive ESG as perhaps the business as usual for the future, rather than this concept that we're talking about. And that's partly because, Rihab also alluded to this, this is not just being driven by regulators and enforcement authorities. It's not even just being pushed by shareholders. It's being pushed by activists, by NGOs, well-resourced NGOs, and the Shell case is a good example of that, because that was led, first of all, in The Hague in relation to holding Shell accountable for not failing to meet a target then and there, but for failing to have enough processes in place to meet the target in the future. Now, this is a lot that's being asked. But, you know, the fact is that whether it's retirees who are wanting to put their investment into resources that align with their values, or employees, and this is probably one of the most interesting elements of ESG, employees who are probably one of our most difficult resources to manage, particularly post-COVID. They would rather be influencers than they would corporate lawyers. So we need to capture them, and part of capturing them is to have companies that align with their values. ESG is a real driver to attract talent and retain that talent. And to retain it, you actually do need to show that you are performing. So, you know, my view is that for India, if we're, you know, this is where we are, for India in terms of its desire to attract more capital, to bring back talent that maybe have left our shores before, and to really strengthen and support these unicorns and these startups that Rihab is supporting, we really do need to demonstrate a different foundation of business structure. And I think ESG is really going to be that driver.
Thanks, Minnie. Manjaree, I would like to ask you the next question. So also, if you wanted to comment on the same question, please feel free to do so. But, you know, part of the reason, the struggle for companies in self-reporting is the lack of regulatory guidance, or not enough of it, or there not being enough precedent. So what do you think is the role of regulators to help in streamlining this compliance burden and to help in creating more credibility for companies and limiting their exposure?
I mean, and I can talk more from an India perspective. I'm sure this is a little more evolved in the Western world. But in India, we are supposed to have, this is going to, 1st of April is going to be the first time the top 1,000 listed entities are expected to make their disclosures on ESG. And I can assure you that there has been a lot of flurry of activity that's going on in, I'm sure in my company as much as in others, where we are wondering, that we spent a lot of time thinking what and how are we supposed to make this disclosure, right? So you went and you checked, and SEBI had come out, which is the regulator in India, to come out with some 9-point guideline program and saying that, you know, they'd created a kind of a form. We began looking at it, and it has very interestingly, you know, because I think the government, I mean, and let me take a step back here. My feel on this has always been that this is also going to travel the way, the journey that CSR has taken in India. So, you know, that started off as a mandatory requirement, and gradually, bit by bit, the government first made it voluntary, kept up with the corporates for a while. Corporates, you know, not very often do voluntary things. So they kept pushing a little more, till the time, if you see for the last 3 years, CSR things have been really made very stringent, and corporates have, over the passage of time, have adopted to that. And but it was something that was kind of graded up in a sort of a graded manner, so it was taken up. I think the same is going to happen here. Given this form that we were seeing, it is broken up into two, which says essential and which says that some leadership comments. So the leadership comment piece is more generic, more sort of broad, things which are not must to have, but good to have. So the must to have comes in the essential part, and then the good to have comes there. So should you want to show that you've done something more than what was just required of you, is something that can come in there. But yes, it's a nice, long, thick form and has many contours to it. And it is not that nobody can fill it up and no one knows how to do it. Of course, there are lawyers, there are other people in the organization. Like ours, we have a department now built up on sustainability, and I'm sure those guys have been doing a fairly, extensive job of going into it. The issue is what to disclose and how to disclose it and how much to disclose. And I'm coming back to Minnie's point and others who mentioned that, again, there is a risk to it. There is whatever you put in there is auditable, and therefore you have to be sure that it is backed up by serious evidence, and that evidence is not going to be something that can cause the company a problem or your investors and shareholders an issue. So it is a whole thing to be understood. Then what is the threshold of materiality? I mean, what is it that you would say would be material enough that it needs to be put into the disclosing form? So, most people are struggling with this. There may be some who may be a little bit ahead of the curve, but I think most of them fall within the, middle section where everybody's trying to figure out what to do. Everybody's seeking support of consultants. It could be law firms. It could be other consultants. They have mushroomed quite in the last year and a half. You would see everybody is jumped on to this ESG bandwagon, and everybody is wanting to give you advice on how to do this best. And I'm sure they have their very good reasons for doing that, and they know what they are doing as well. But I think in the first year, everybody is going to be looking at it in a little more circumspect manner, to err on the side of caution, I would say, because you really don't know how the regulator is going to address this and look at it. But I am quite hopeful that, after the first year, the second year, I think by 2025, you will see that we will be more firmly entrenched in how and what we are going to disclose and what would be the expectations of the regulator. The regulator part that you'd mentioned, Upasana, is what could regulators do better? The regulators will do something more. I feel that, they've started with it. They brought up this 9-point program, guidelines. They are waiting for you to, interpret it and come back to them for them to review. When they will take a look at it, they would see, okay, how much are companies disclosing? Are they really going and giving what is required, or are they being rather circumspect about it? Based on that information, I feel, by next year, once they've reviewed all of this, you will see that there may be some notifications or circulars come out which might extend or might clarify things a little more, depending on what it is. And I think by the third year, you would find things far more streamlined. That's my thought on it.
That's a very sensible visual thinking that it'll clear up soon. But also, SEBI is also, they've also already recommended that certain things which are under leadership indicators may very soon become mandatory, even before the first year of implementation.
I think organizations will also evolve. You might call me a little bit optimistic on it, but I think I go back to the way we've looked at CSR. And if it's a kind of an analogy to fall back on, the way everybody was being very, very, cagey in the beginning, what to do, how to do. Half the time your CSR budget went into the Prime Minister's, that fund where you just deposited there, not doing much about it because you really didn't know what to do with it. Nobody told you that something called a CSR activity was there. But look the way it has taken off. And those leadership indicators actually get translated into something which becomes a little more mandatory. The reason why I feel SEBI's put that in is because companies are also, finding their way through this maze of ESG. They are profit making, and therefore they need to make sure that their business goals are quite aligned with this. You can't have a business goal and you can't have an ESG goal that doesn't align with what is the business perspective, right? So the two have to marry, and it also must be a value creation in some form for the organization, and also service your requirements for ESG. So it's a tight rope to walk, where I think the boards and the senior management plays a very, very important role. And the directions have to come from the top. They have to think through it. They must align with the management, and then it has to percolate down into the employees, because they are the ones who are going to be the operational guys who are going to execute these goals. So it's a whole ecosystem that has to align with this new way of thinking.
Absolutely. And Dharini, this reporting is also something that investors rely on, right? And like Manjaree mentioned, in India, we are looking at a few years where it sort of becomes clearer on what kind of reporting, what is enough, what is not, what should be the measurement tools, etc. And in fact, the Indian regulator SEBI has also, in a consultation paper, they have noted that different jurisdictions have different commitments and different sort of transition paths, right? And different operational realities, as Manjaree also mentioned. So the domestic context has to be kept in mind when even financial investors look at companies, as well as rating agencies, right? So now, from IFC's perspective, for instance, what is your approach when you make that distinction between different portfolio companies, and you have your own, as you mentioned earlier, that you have your own performance standards, your own green bond principles, right? So how are these reconciled and applied by investors?
So I think look at it from two different perspectives. From when you say when we apply our performance standards and when we do our due diligence in terms of before we invest, what do we look at? I think the MDB world is a little bit different. The MDB world doesn't really doesn't relax the standards for our own performance standards, our own requirements for emerging markets. We do understand that there is a trajectory, there is a transition phase, and then we involve, it's a very detailed discussion that happens between our sustainability teams and the clients' teams, and they come up with an action plan with a process to compliance. So we know that today you may not be, but you will be in a few years, and there is a very detailed action plan. So that's what we do at the point at which we come in. But once we're in, reporting is also based on our own formats. Now, I think here's where the issue of cost comes in, right? So when we talk about cost what is the cost of compliance with ESG requirements? Absent standardization, that cost is very high. So when you look at step away and look at it from the perspective of a policymaker, from SEBI's perspective or the government's perspective, and by the way, I think, Manjaree, that this might follow a little different trajectory than CSR because there are other factors driving it, right? Our Prime Minister has made some very strong commitments at COP26. So there is a path that we need to follow. And CSR was maybe a nice to have, it was a good thing to do. And it's sort of like a far distant second cousin of the ESG requirements, which the genesis for which are very different. And they're based in international law, they're based in, not just treaty, but also regulation. So I think standardization is actually very important. And this again brings me back to sort of the theme of this entire conference, which is globalization and convergence. We can't ignore the fact that companies in India today are global. They have a footprint, they have businesses overseas, or they at least have customers overseas, right? So a company here, garment manufacturer, say, selling into the EU, has to look at the supply chain requirements that Minnie was talking about. So if they have to do that, they're already complying with it. So when we talk about whether we have unique needs that would require a completely different set of regulations, I know we like to do it the India way, we like to fine tune everything, but we have to, as maybe from a regulator standpoint, look at the cost of compliance of that. People are already complying with something. It would just be much easier if the forms, if the reporting, if the requirements are converged in some way. So I do think this is not to make small of the fact that our circumstances might be unique. We do have $1 billion plus, $1.5 billion, I don't know at last count, people. There are social issues that are very different. There are just transition issues that are very different that we need to sort of consider as well. But I think there is some sort of a midway approach to doing this. And from an investor standpoint, investors will be driven by their own regulatory requirements, their own sort of, stated commitments, and they will require this of their investee companies. So I think if you step away and look at it in the context that we see ourselves in today, in the context of what is required by international law, what is required by regulators in different places, and therefore what companies find themselves having to do, it would make sense from a policy standpoint, I think, to kind of align both reporting as well as compliance requirements. And as counsel, and I wanted to just comment on another aspect of this. What is our role as counsel? So I work for an investor. And for example, IFC has, we've committed to make 35% of all our investments in climate-focused investments. So there has to be a clean, not just do no harm agenda, there has to be a positive impact on the climate in looking at those businesses. So we'll be looking at new products, we'll be looking at, there's blended finance is a huge thing. We realize that there is, especially when you look at new technologies, you look at green hydrogen technology, or you look at storage technology, there is a risk of whether the technology is unproved, and what would incentivize a sponsor to take it on, to try it. Sponsors are looking for IRRs. They want to ensure that their investment makes them a minimum IRR. But the technology may not, none of the models they run might get them there, right, and make them make the investment. So you bring in, investors like MDBs particularly, who want to move things in the right direction, provide a blended finance piece, maybe a piece of concessional finance, maybe a grant or a subordinated loan, or some sort of equity piece there, which changes the IRR, changes the model, which incentivizes the sponsor to make the investment. And so as counsel, how do we support those initiatives? We support them by finding the right products to ensure that investors can come in and make the investments they need to make in order to encourage clients to do what they need to do for mitigation or resilience purposes. So I think that's, for me, I don't think we can avoid the convergence of regulations question. I think, it's upon us and we have to face it. We can obviously spend time fine-tuning, but in the time we spend fine-tuning too much, the capital will go away elsewhere. So if we want to keep that, the 23 trillion or whatever the number is, if we want to keep it, we want to ensure it flows into this country, I think we'll be well served to, whether through regulations that SEBI puts in place, which might, I think SEBI is playing kind of a wait-and-watch game, and I honestly think that the policy will follow the practice here. So companies will voluntarily begin to comply with, say, IFC's green bond principles in order to, and we've already made, sustainability bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, green bonds that follow our principles. So when companies are already doing that, the value of perhaps having that in place more generally it exists. So I think there will be a convergence of regulation, and I think it'll be a good thing in terms of cost, actually.
No, and just to add to your point, you make a good point, and I kind of agree with you. And my point was, the CSR piece was not for this, but for the fact that there is going to be a little wait and watch. But I also agree with you when you say that companies are also, see, the government is on a fast track on this on one side, and then you have a regulator which is looking at it. From a government perspective, there is just so much happening on this side, and government wants to bring in green technology, green fuels, green whatever it has, and then it is giving a lot of incentives for that. So the businesses are anyways looking to go into that and capture that, because it is also going to give you credits. It's also going to tie in with the larger the goals that the country has set for itself. So I think, to your point, Dharini, I agree with you that after a while, I think the regulator will be left with no choice but to catch up fast, because again, the cost of non-compliance is high. Everything, if it is streamlined and standardized and everyone knows about it, it becomes just so much easier to, sort of make the disclosures. Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Actually, I wanted to have a follow-up question for Dharini, because you mentioned that, from an investor standpoint, you have dedicated certain investment amounts towards clean sectors. And I guess it would also work reverse, where certain sectors become no-go. So how do you reconcile the transition finance that is needed for those sectors to actually become cleaner? That's also a very important consideration. And if you could please be a bit concise in your answer, because we want to open it to audience questions.
No, very quickly, that's completely fair, which is why we have 35%, which is committed to clean climate finance, and the MDBs have a combined list where there is a no-go list, and then there's a negative list, and then there's, so anything that locks in carbon or is a new investment in coal technology, in a coal power plant, that would be like on that list. But we do understand that there is transition, which is why 65% is still Paris aligned, which does no harm, but it could still have an element that is, as long as they're on the path to decarbonization, or as long, so it's looking at it in terms of what will happen in the future. But that's basic, in short, that's what it is.
Fair enough. So thanks, Dharini. I think we have time for a few questions, if there are any in the audience. Is there a mic, or can you pass on a mic? Or you can just speak up. Who's asking?
Hi, my question is might sound quite basic, but the cost of complying with ESG is ultimately going to be bared by the consumer. And what impact will ESG have on the inflation? Everything's becoming more and more expensive, and the cost of compliances are going up, and ultimately the consumer bears the brunt of it. So how are you going to balance inflation and ESG?
I was just going to say that, you're right, there's always a cost to these things. And just touching back with the last points that we covered, having these mechanisms for tick-the-box compliance, in my view, is actually potentially a waste of money. And this is the problem with these disclosure requirements. And it's not just SEBI, it's all around the world. There's just this whole paperwork of disclosure. But it's really the substantive changes that are going to make the difference in terms of, and that is actually for the benefit of the consumer. So yeah, the consumer is prepared to pay more if they believe that they're going to get a product which is more aligned with their values. And that's been proven in terms of many studies that have been done. So interestingly, people are also prepared to wait for longer term returns on investments that are ESG bounded. But I think the problem we have at the moment is we don't have a global standard. This is a truly global driver, and yet we don't have an agreed global standard. And so we're just letting countries instigate these tick-the-box requirements, which, I spoke to somebody in Mumbai the other day, and I explained that if you're going to put a disclosure, then you're going to have, the evidence to back it up and prove that the evidence is there. And she said, oh, so I have to be realistic. I said, yes, not just realistic, but accurate. So yeah, I think the consumer. I don't think that's the key issue here. It's a waste of costs.
Just to your point, if I might add, you make a very good point, because corporates then, whatever is the additional cost, pass it down to the customers and consumers. So consumer has to bear the brunt. I agree there, but again, I think there would be a certain section of customers who would be willing to pay that extra price for having a product that actually reconciles with their values and how they wish to see the world look. But in a country like India, where there is a vast majority where price points are a very big issue. So if in my industry, if a car, which is a normal ICE engine car, which would cost you about 5 lakhs, the moment you make an EV and make it with green technology, the cost goes up. And you would find the same thing becoming much more expensive. For the common man, that becomes a problem. Now, when the government, and we are very cognizant of this, and there's a lot of talk going on with the government in this, but the government is also is recognizing it, and I'm sure in the future will recognize it more, because there will have to be some incentives. There will have to be a certain, where, say for example in an EV, the cost of battery has to be reduced in some manner, because only then will the cost of car not go up substantially and the burden will not be passed to the consumer. So I think it's going to be, and corporates are also looking at it. Now somebody might say corporates, and they will say, okay, if it is expensive, you expect me to make it, you put a law around it. So here it is, now I'll do this. And no, that's not really what it is. I think the corporates are also equally cognizant that if people don't buy their products, then they will, the damage is anyways there. There is a cost involved in that as well. So I think it's going to be a bit of a combination of both things. Governments are also going to look at greater incentivization, seeing how the cost of production can be brought down.
Subsidies itself, right? For EVs itself, the government has provided them. So more and more products. In fact, there was a PwC research conducted on about 18,000 customers. 76% of them have said that they're willing to align with products that they feel more strongly about. So there's stats, the proper stats from these consulting firms now. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a forensic and compliance professional for many years. And while we all do what we are supposed to do as legal compliance professionals, an incident that comes to my mind is Volkswagen, right? It was a cultural breakdown to kind of circumvent the emission norms which fell in the ESG space. Sorry. And I think my question is a little bit to all of you, but specifically to Minnie. You do a lot of investigations at Baker McKenzie, right? So what next after that, when you're doing all the paper compliance and then you're doing the with heart compliance, and so where do we go from here? These things still continue to happen and will happen.
It was actually a failure of governance. Right? That it wasn't a failure of culture, it was a failure of governance, because governance, as I said, is much more than just having the standards and controls. It's how leaders need to ensure that those standards and controls are met. It also means that hard questions need to be asked, the utilisation of, proper investigation when a whistleblower raises an issue. I'm not going to comment on the actual matter, but I see it replicated in so many matters. Whistleblowing programs are a key part of governance. Having them, making sure that you listen to the whistleblower and making sure that you investigate those matters that you need to. So it's a good question. I don't think we will stop. I think the key elements of ESG is that it needs to be tested, and it does need to have evidence, and it does need to be credible in order for it to genuinely work.
I just actually wanted to add to what she said, and also going back to the earlier question and to sort of sum this up. I think it's also about advocacy, whether it's us as lawyers or the people who are espousing these causes. I think it is important for everyone to understand what is in it for them. And once people understand that, I think it comes much easier, whether to bear an additional cost or to comply in a more meaningful way. And a very simple example would be sort of green buildings in India. I think when IFC started giving these loans, there was almost no uptake. And these are all affordable housing, less than 50 lakhs. Most ticket sizes are even 20 lakhs. So small homes, most people's first homes. It costs a lot to put in sort of a insulated roof, to have better windows, to construct in a certain way. It does increase the cost. But once people understood that from an energy efficiency perspective, over the course of the time that they would live in the home, as well as from a water utilization perspective, the costs and the availability of water, how it would be used. Once people understood what there was in it for them, the penetration of these loans and the uptake in green affordable housing has been phenomenal. It is one of the most phenomenal. And of course, standardization has a role to play, but advocacy has a really important role to play. And I do think that, at all our different levels, maybe as internal counsel, external counsel, once people get that, I think it makes sense. I might sound a bit idealistic, but I think a lot of this is kind of idealistic, if you think about it, right?
No, thank you. I think there will always be the people who do jugaad, the shortcut way, not necessarily the innovative way, but I think somewhere there is also that imperative of building ESG in the design element of it. And I hope Gen Z that is sitting here, a lot of them in the audience, take that away as well. So thank you so much for answering that for me.
Just one more thing, because you spoke about Volkswagen. There's also Vedanta that happened, right? The plant shut, banks suffered. There were like debts of we don't know how many crores that were sitting. 1,500 people were not employed randomly in 2018, approximately. Dharini spoke about the shell company. I think the onus is now going on the directors. The fiduciary duties are becoming very, very critical right now. So just to touch upon that again, 11 directors have been sued in their personal capacity. And that's huge, exactly, thumbs up. So it makes all of us more cognizant of the fact that we need to pull up people and let them know that it's not about just so the difference again between a law firm lawyer and a in-house counsel would be this can't be done, and a in-house counsel would be we'll manage the risk. And now we got to be very, very proactive because it's a sliding slope. So I think I'd like to say and end with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end this discussion at. And thank you for being here. And thank you to all the panelists for the wonderful inputs. And also thank you to ABA International Law Section for putting this event together. Thanks.